Today on CityCast DC. For the first time in 3 decades, DC only saw 127 homicides in 2025, a dramatic drop that's part of a national trend. But our play cousins over in Baltimore have an even more impressive story. Their homicide rate plummeted to a nearly 50-year low. So what's behind these numbers? Today we're talking with Dr. Joseph Richardson, MPower Professor at University of Maryland and co-chair of DC's Homicide Review Committee, about what's actually working to reduce gun violence. Today is Wednesday, January 28th. I'm Bridget Todd, and here's what DC is talking about. Dr. Richardson, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me back.
So the reason that I wanted to talk to you was that I've been seeing so much news about our neighbors. I sometimes think of Baltimore as as DC's play cousin. You know, they have been making headlines for this very impressive drop in homicide numbers. Cut to the chase. What is Baltimore doing that DC's not?
Well, for Baltimore, they had a strategic plan for community violence intervention that they were committed to. And I recall when Brandon Scott was elected, kind of laid out these are the reductions that he wanted to see in gun violence every year. And pretty much he's adhered to it. And he stuck with the CVI strategic plan and kind of doubled down even when things were not going right. CVI is community violence intervention. So these are the programs such as the violence interrupters, hospital violence intervention programs that are situated in high-risk neighborhoods and work with high-risk individuals that are at the greatest risk for violent offending and violent victimization. They stuck to the plan. They just didn't create a new shiny object to divert people away from that things may be going in the wrong direction in the city. And I often see in, the administration we have now in DC, there's constantly the creation of new programs. We don't have a strategic plan that we've adhered to over time, even though there have been some rough spots, which I think Brandon Scott has been able to do. He's been able to keep things together by continuing the investment and coordination of programs and bringing really strong evidence-based and evidence-informed programs to Baltimore. And then they have the group violence reduction strategy, the GVRS, and which is another element. And I wouldn't necessarily say, I don't want to call that CVI because there's a law enforcement component to it, but you can also attribute the drop in gun violence to the success of that program. And so if you just think about all of the different parts under their ecosystem, whether it's the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement and Safe Streets, or ROCA, or GVRS, and their hospital violence intervention programs at Johns Hopkins and shock trauma, and then the hospital responder programs that they have at other institutions like Sinai, I can understand why they've had such great success. One of the other things that I just really want to uplift with Mayor Scott as well, I don't know if people have been keeping up with the contentious debate about the drastic drop in homicides and shootings in Baltimore, who should take credit for it. And you see the debate between Ivan Bates, who is the state's attorney for Baltimore, in a debate with Brandon Scott. And Brandon Scott is staying 10 toes down with that. CVI has a piece that should be acknowledged in terms of these drastic drops, and he's not moving away from that. And the state's attorney is basically saying, well, it's law enforcement. It's my office that's responsible for it because we're doing a better job at prosecuting all of these people, and we're doing a more effective job of being tough on crime. And so you even see that debate playing out in Baltimore. And I'm glad to see a mayor that's actually pushing back against that tough on crime law enforcement narrative, because we know we can't arrest our way out of it, that CVI and his investment and belief in CVI is working.
Paint me a picture of what this actually looks like. What does this work actually look like day to day?
It can vary from day to day. It could be two neighborhoods that are at conflict with each other, and it may have started on social media. It may have started in the street, may have started on social media. So we also have to include that not only are violence interrupters responsible for what happens in a physical space, they also have to keep track of what's happening virtually and in a digital space in those communities, and to be able to intervene based on their knowledge, based on their ability to use cognitive behavioral therapy, which they're also engaging in informally while they're in the street. It's kind of informal counseling per se. So, you're asking people to take on a lot without having the same level of status as first responders as we would give to police officers or EMS or firefighters. These are also first responders in terms of gun violence intervention and prevention, and they're constantly putting out small fires every day. The vast majority of our violence interrupters are from the same neighborhoods where they do the work, and for valid reasons, because they need to have those relationships in order to be credible in those communities. But I would say that, from an organizational standpoint, we operate under a system where contracts are renewed every year. So you can take it outside of the CVI world into just a contracting situation with a company with a state or federal government. Just imagine what it would be like if you had a contract and it was up for renewal every single year. What kind of stability would you have in terms of your own employment and your perceptions of your employment? It creates a very unstable environment and climate. And so we need to change the policies and protocols regarding how we deliver and enforce contracts with organizations. They should be a much longer period, 3 years, with the option for renewal. But if you're in a system where we're constantly renewing contracts in a year, just it fuels instability.
So the last time that you and I talked, we were talking about crime, and it was definitely a hot topic in the city, and it continues to be a hot topic in both DC and Baltimore. So we know that DC experienced a 30-year low in homicides in 2025, with 127 for that year. What can you attribute that drop to?
I think that's the $1 million question that we don't have the answers to right now. And it's going to take a much deeper dive by researchers to understand what was driving the significant drop. It could potentially be better policing, more prosecutions of high risk people in the district. Definitely could be attributed to community violence intervention programs in the district. So it could be a host of and a number of issues, both in DC and in Baltimore, and as well as across the nation, because we've seen historic declines in gun violence across the country. I think it's a little bit premature to try to make some conclusive statements regarding what was actually driving the decrease at this point. But I think we have some ideas, but we need to confirm.
So you mentioned these violence intervention efforts. I gather that it might be too early to say this specific thing is having this impact on crime, but what role do you see those intervention efforts having played in this 30-year low?
Well, definitely, we know that there has been a historic investment during the Biden administration in community violence intervention programs, which started roughly, around 2020, and a little bit before that, but definitely during the Biden administration, where we stood up the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. There were many state offices of gun violence prevention. Maryland stood an office up in the state of Maryland, and so I would say that that may have been a contributing factor. Clearly, the significant investment, and now we're beginning to see the return on our investment. And if you look at the studies that have been conducted on the effectiveness of CVI, for example, Dan Webster, my colleague at Johns Hopkins, conducted a study on the effectiveness of the Cure Violence program in Baltimore, which is under the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, the Safe Streets program, found that over a 3 to 5 year, you would see significant drops anywhere between like 30 and 50% in the reduction in shootings. But it takes the investment in building trust with those neighborhoods to begin to see that return on investment. And so I think based on the investment that we've had in gun violence and community violence intervention, starting with the Biden administration, we're beginning to see those returns on investment.
It's good to have that context of these programs and their effectiveness and seeing the return on the investment of these programs. But I feel like we have to sort of talk about the elephant in the room, which, of course, is federal interference from the Trump administration and the National Guard presence here in D.C., which we know were huge things in 2025 and continue to be things going into the new year. When that all happened, I remember having a conversation with a family member out of town, and they were like, well, aren't you kind of happy that happened? Because it does seem like crime is going down. And at a family gathering, that was not necessarily the complex conversation I was looking to have. But how do you see the National Guard and federal interference affecting all of this?
So first, for the record, when Trump decided to bring federal resources, law enforcement resources to DC and other cities across the country, gun violence was already declining. Gun violence has been declining in many cities for the past 2 to 3 years, right? Since COVID. So to make the stretch that the federal law enforcement was the panacea to all of the gun violence problems that were affecting cities, I think he was a year or two too late. Right. And if you understand the statistics, which many of us do, I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist. You can Google these things. You would know that when the federal law enforcement arrived in DC, gun violence had been declining again for the past 2 years. So to make these assumptions that they were the knights in shining armor coming in on their horses to solve the problems that were happening in many communities that have been disproportionately impacted by gun violence is totally inaccurate. And the other thing I would say is that his administration led to the most significant cuts in community violence intervention and prevention resources at the tune of he cut over $800 million from the DOJ to support community violence intervention and prevention programming. And so even with less money, and we also have to acknowledge that the Biden administration dollars are running out. Many of those dollars have run out in 2026 and probably will finally be exhausted in 2027. If you look at the number of sites that were in DC prior to a lot of these budget cuts, we had a more robust number of CVI sites in the city. They have now been cut significantly. So doing more with less is the state of where we are right now.
What is the current state of DC's violent intervention programs right now? We know that DC's budget went through a lot of changes and that often, as you said, these programs are the first on the chopping block. So where do we stand right now?
So there have been significant cuts to DC violence intervention, particularly street outreach, which has led to the merger, of our Cure the Streets program, which was under the Office of the Attorney General, has now merged into the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. So at one point we had two violence intervention agencies in the district that did street outreach violence intervention work. Now we have one, but as the result of that merger, Many of the sites that were under the office of the Attorney General under the Cure the Streets model have now been eliminated. So now, again, you're asking people who are already maxed out and their bandwidth is maxed out and the capacity to do the work in the neighborhoods where they're working. Now they have to assume community violence intervention efforts in neighborhoods that where we found that gun violence had those CVI sites have been eliminated. And merely because gun violence may have been reduced in those neighborhoods, which could be attributable, I'm not saying totally attributable, but could be attributable in part to a CVI site that was there, to make the assumption that gun violence is now reduced in certain neighborhoods and we should just magically just walk away from it, to me is a very short-sighted approach. And so what is happening in the district is we've eliminated a number of sites in neighborhoods that have historically had high rates of gun violence. And, you know, I hope in my most, optimistic um, mind frame that we don't return back to the gun violence that was happening in those neighborhoods. But we have to be realistic as well that we've removed some critical resources from those neighborhoods, which may have contributed to significant drops in gun violence.
I don't even really know how to ask this, but when we experienced that genuine spike in violence and crime in 2023 here in the district, it was a conversation that we were having a lot. Like, we did lots of episodes about it. Listeners and neighbors were very much concerned, rightly so. And I wonder if it's the kind of thing where when crime is ticking up, everybody's talking about it, everybody's frustrated. When it ticks down, people kind of forget about it. And so these programs, it's easier to not talk about them, not see the value add that they actually do have in keeping communities safe. And then when they're on the chopping block, because it's not on the news every single day and it's not in conversation every single day, it's easier for those programs to sort of be erased. And then if they go away, crime might start ticking back up. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I am. That's exactly what we often hear in our work with CVI sites is that, and these are their words, not mine, that you can work your way out of a job for like your success could actually lead to your unemployment. So you may be doing such a great job that the powers that be see no need to keep a site in that neighborhood. Right? Where we know, again, as you mentioned, because we've just seen drops for 1 or 2 years, that we need to think about sustainability. How do we continue to have those significant drops over a 5, 10, 15-year period? And we just can't make these really quick, rash decisions based on the success of 1 or 2 years in drops in violence when we don't clearly know why those drops are happening. And then just to reiterate the point that you made, when we have gun violence record highs of we've seen in 2023, I think we were at 274, and we were one of a handful of cities where we were seeing gun violence going up. And when we have record highs, it's very easy for law enforcement to not take credit, right, for the highs. And then when we see these record lows, then everyone wants to step out on their bully pulpit and say, well, yeah, it's because we have better policing or we have a stronger prosecution, right? But when things are going wrong, it's pretty much no one wants to take accountability. And in many respects, that's when CBI gets blamed. Like, well, why should we have CBI? There are 274 murders, but now that we're down to 128, 127, I don't hear the same argument.
So much of what we talked about today has been about how in DC, not only have these programs been cut, but that also that crime was just sort of dropping anyway. With these programs being cut, do you see a future where homicide rates do end up ticking back up in DC?
I would hope not, but I wouldn't say that may necessarily be isolated to DC with all the cuts. We may see with the cuts, a reversal in the positive steps that we've taken with gun violence going up in other cities. And again, optimistically, I would hope that that does not happen. But we also need to be, based on what we've experienced over the past year or so, we also need to be very realistic about pivoting away from our over reliance on the federal government to support the work. And so what we're seeing now is more of a pivoting towards philanthropy and private investment. And so, for example, I recently started working on a project scaling communities in Chicago, which is kind of scaling up CVI in Chicago. And that work is being supported by private investors because we also need to understand that everybody is affected by gun violence. And so our business community needs to also step up. And private investors need to understand that the public safety of all of our communities is good for business as well. And so not relying so heavily on the federal government because we've seen what has happened with this administration, but thinking about alternative ways to support the work. In the same way, we've thought about alternative ways to public safety by supporting CVI as an alternative to law enforcement. We also need to think about and be very intentional about alternative ways to support the work by not relying on the federal government to save us, because it's not. And relying more on how do we generate other dollars, whether they're private dollars or dollars that are coming from the state. We need to be more creative with the ways that we sustain the work.
Dr. Richardson, thank you so much for being here. This has been very illuminating.
Thank you. I appreciate you always having me on.
That is all for today here on CityCast UC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. And consider supporting our work by becoming a CityCast UC neighbor. You can do that at membership.citycast.fm. It's $10 a month. You'll support our journalism, get ad-free listening, a special events newsletter, and other perks. We will be back tomorrow morning with even more news from around the city. Talk to you then.